I'm going to be looking at Pentecostal Christianity, and in particular, how this form of Christianity is making meaning of COVID, and in the process, completely reframing COVID. So just a very, very quick overview. We have various different types of Pentecostalism. I'm not going to go into them. The type of Pentecostalism I'm going to look at is what we call prophetic Pentecostalism. It's the type of Pentecostalism that is getting the most traction or coverage in the media at the moment. And it looks at or proposes the idea that a select group of people known as prophets have got particular powers to bring about health and wealth by driving out demons. The church I'm looking at in particular is called Rabboni Christian Ministries. It was started by somebody called Lesego Daniel, and he refers to himself as a prophet, as a professor and a prophet. Professor because he got a degree somewhere at a university in America. The church started in 2002 in Garenkoor, which is a peri-urban area outside of Pretoria. And until lockdown, this particular church, you can see here the church building, it's quite rural looking, it looks out onto farmland. They had about 3,000 members, so it was a small but growing steadily church. Key elements of this church were, they talked a lot about healing, particularly through deliverance from evil spirits. Evil spirits also included holding people in poverty. So the pastor would prophesy varying forms of prosperity into people's lives. They would become wealthy, they would meet the person they wanted to meet, etc. And we had all sorts of mediated and performed types of faith. And the big understanding of the world, the way the world was framed in this church before COVID, was that evil spirits and witchcraft were the reason why people weren't happy, healthy, and wealthy. This church got into the media because in 2014, the prophet told people to eat grass and to drink petrol. And if they did this, the evil spirits would be exorcised out of them and they would be able to experience all the miracles that they were looking for. And then COVID hit, and this church went online. They very quickly started having services for 7 to 8 hours a day, Monday to Sunday. In the services, they would have prayer meetings, they would have testimonies, they would have singing, they would have varying people giving sermons. And as they became more sophisticated, they also moved onto Zoom platform. And so people started Zooming in, giving their questions, giving their testimonies, etc. This is just a typical moment where the pastor is preaching and people are raising their hands because they have comments and they have questions and they have prayer requests. Here is the pastor interacting with people, and this can go on for 3-4 hours. He takes the different requests and he gives people prophecies into their lives and explains dreams. These tend to be two of the really important things. So what I did was I downloaded some of the sermons. I transcribed these sermons, testimonies, and confessions, because these are the key places where you can hear what people are saying, and then did a discourse analysis of that. And I'm just going to touch on some of the key issues. The first one was a whole series of testimonies talking about people getting healed from COVID. So they went for a test, they felt ill, they then got prayer, and they then got healed. But sometimes that healing didn't last. And that was because they started to do things that they shouldn't have done, or they lost faith and the illness returned. I'm going to come back to these ideas just now. So what these churches have started to do is completely reframe their theologies. So they've gone from this prosperity theology, where all negative things are because of evil spirits, and the man of God can exorcise these spirits, and everybody can enjoy health and prosperity, and suffering is not part of God's plan, to a very different track that says The godly path includes suffering. Personal failures are your responsibility, not the work of the devil or evil forces. You have to change your behavior, in other words, become good, to expect miracles. And we need, this is the church speaking, to reframe our experiences and the reality that we live in, to understand that this is God working and not some virus that is just willy-nilly going around the world. Prayers are not working because people don't have enough faith, and the churches are starting to say that grief and how we deal with it is an important part of the Christian life and ministry. So rather than saying good things happen to Christians, and if they're not happening to you, you have a problem, there is now a move to saying grief and suffering are part of the Christian journey. You need to take responsibility for your own actions and to understand the difficulties and sufferings as part of God's will. So this reframing of meaning making. So the first one is to understand unemployment, understanding ineffectiveness of prayers, understanding the trauma of multiple deaths, the trauma and suffering that is seen as random, how to reframe that, and COVID isolation. What these churches are saying is that the rampant unemployment in South Africa is not the fault of COVID, but rather God's divine plan. Within the Old Testament, there is an idea of the year of Jubilee, which would happen every 50 years. And in this year of Jubilee, everybody would not work. It would be a year of rest. And the prophet is saying people have never adhered to this, but now in COVID, God is calling us to this year of rest. So people are not unemployed because of COVID. They are in the year of rest that God has ordained. COVID is not because of evil spirits, but because people are not obeying God. And so the online prayers, intercessions, and prophets that go on every day is a way for people to turn back to God and change their lives. Trauma is not random. God has a plan. The community as a whole is suffering, and communities must come together so that we don't experience COVID and all its trauma in isolation. And this is done by these online church services, particularly through Zoom and WhatsApp. And while people don't know how to cope with COVID and all its trauma, the prophet does know. And God is giving him particular insights. Most important insight that people are getting at the moment is that this is the year of rest. This is not the year of prosperity. It's not the year of miracles. It is the year of rest. So all of you who are listening to this and feeling quite skeptical about all of it, yes, what this pastor is doing is reframing his inability to heal people, which is what he was claiming to do 2 years ago, to now saying that this is divinely ordained. One of the most important changes of this church has been to tell people to confess. And this whole idea is that individuals should take responsibility for their own situation. And here we have somebody confessing. Now, while this may surface level sound like a lot of Christianity that you've heard before, what has been very interesting in this church is how much attention they have paid to alcohol and drug abuse and physical abuse and self-harming. In the confessions, these 4 things come up so often that if you would take just an analysis of this church, you would see in a snapshot how, particularly in South Africa and Southern Africa, the rates of people at least talking about violence and violence against themselves, violence being perpetrated to them, heightened alcohol addiction and drug addiction are, for most people that are writing into this church, probably more important than a fear of getting COVID. So what these confessions do is they allow people to write into the church what their confessions are. And I've got there basically the things that people are confessing. And then this particular pastor reads them out and says to people, your sins are forgiven. And people write in saying how this is transforming their lives, how they are able to give up alcohol, how they're able to give up drugs, how in the space of no work and no hope, they are being able to take more responsibility for their lives. So we have lots of confessions. This one that I've taken out in particular is the person is talking about having pity for themselves because they feel as though they are in such a difficult place. And they are confessing this kind of sense of anxiety and self-pity, and that through this confession, they hope to find some sort of peace. And in tracking these churches, this person then came back a couple of weeks later and gave a testimony to say how by having confessed this sin, she felt much more at ease and she was coping better with life. So what's really going on here? Well, one of the key things is a reframing of anxieties. In these testimonies and confessions, spiritual anxiety, anxiety about COVID, finances, depression, and the kind of trauma that people are going through are key. And you see how this church offers a space for people to work through and express many of these anxieties. And these anxieties get reframed in the church, not as uncontrollable things, but as something that in the thinking of the church and the language of the church, you have ways to manage and to explain. There's been an extraordinary reframing of the individual self. Now, a lot of you will recognize a kind of Weberian Protestant ethic happening here, but this was not something that was part of the church before COVID. And so there's a reflection on the individual self, writing down your confessions or testimonies, taking personal responsibility, not blaming everything on witchcraft, and connecting with other people. And these connections mainly through the churches online. And so what the churches are offering is of real therapeutic value to those who participate. They feel that they are healed through the services. They feel that their anxieties are lowered. And the church really seems to be addressing addiction. People feel that they are more positive and have a greater positive sense of self. And there is a reframing of trauma not to be something random, but something that collectively this community are going through together and which God is aware of and has a plan for. So overall, these churches have been seen very, very negatively. And there are churches where there is a lot of abuse, or has been a lot of abuse. But through COVID, one church in particular, Rabboni, which I looked at, is a church that is reframing and therefore creating new meaning out of COVID and offering people a way in which to manage their stress, their anxieties, and for many people, their sense of unemployment. Thank you very much.